welcome to our second day of the workshop on nature, the value of normativity. Today we will have two sections. First, a section on research papers presented by Michele Mangini, Mario Di Carlo, and Aaron Kelly. And in the afternoon we have the second section with another talk by Michele Mangini, and then the group discussions and the round table. So let me introduce very shortly Michele Mangini, our first speaker of today. Michele Mangini has graduated in law at the University of Bari in 1985 with a thesis on the sociology of law, and has been away between the 10 years between 1987 and 1997 in further different places like the Yale Law School, the NYU Law School, the Oxford University, the SOR also has Benincasa Institute in Naples, and finally at the Harvard University. In 2004 he did his PhD in political philosophy at Sussex University with a thesis entitled The Good Life in Liberal State. Between 2001 he was working at Sussex University as a Marie Curie Fellow on the issue of the ethical integration of Europe. He started teaching sociology at the law school of the University at Bari in 2002 and has been teaching political philosophy as an associate professor since 2005. He's currently teaching there ethics, law, and philosophy of law. Amongst his many research interests, I will name just a few. The field of economic analysis of law, applied ethics, especially environmental ethics, and more recently central issues in liberal theory, legal reasoning, especially with a focus on the connection between liberal theory and Aristotelian perfectionism. Let me end by just naming three of his main publications. 2005, Il pluralismo forte dell'etica pubblica perfezionista. 2009, Diritto naturale e liberalismo, dialogo e conflitto, and 2010, Ethics, Virtue, Perfectionism, and Natural Law in the European Journal of Legal Studies. Here, I'm very happy to have you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcus, for the introduction, and first of all, thank you to Professor Gabriele De Anna for inviting me here. It's been a pleasure to be here for discussion and to present this paper. For present this paper, that is very much a work in progress. I have to introduce the issue by saying it is a work in progress, and it's something on which this is the first presentation, and I hope that the discussion will be interesting for you and fruitful for me in order to get some feedback and go on improving and making changes. But of course, I hope I can still hold on the main argument. Now, this paper concerns a jurisprudential case. It is a paper that starts from a jurisprudential case that is a European Court of Human Rights case that came out a few years ago, and it was a very famous and controversial case. It is called the crucifix case. It is a case that raises the issue of religion within a liberal state. And it is a case that was discussed in front of several courts, Italian courts, before going to the European Court of Human Rights. And it is particularly interesting also from the point of view of the judicial reasoning, because you find several courts deciding in different ways and getting to different decisions that are sometimes opposite to each other. And the top judiciary level of Italy, that is the Corte di Cassazione, decided in a way which was then reversed by the European Court of Human Rights. although not relying on the same reasons. What I've tried to do, just by way of a general introduction, is to confront, on this case, a few different views of contemporary liberal writers who have contributed to the debate about, obviously, liberal politics, let's say the realm of so-called public reason. So, first of all, John Rawls, Habermas, and more contemporary writers, people who are still giving out their papers on these issues, such as Rainer Forst from Germany, Frank Michael from Harvard, and Alessandro Ferrara, who teaches in Rome, but his book, Democratic Horizon, has been by now discussed all over the world, and there is a sort of internal discussion between the last two, between Michael and Ferrara, and they've been discussing in Rome in a seminar that we organized last year, and there is a sort of continuation of this discussion going on. Their discussions are not aimed at the issue that I'm discussing here, the case of the crucifix, but my attempt has been that of trying to apply hypothetical consequences of their views to the crucifix case. So it's a sort of thought experiment in a way. This paper is trying to conjecture what the possible resolutions of this case might be on the grounds of the view of each of these people that I just named. So this is a case that is particularly relevant as a way of showing the function of the principle of neutrality, or in Italy people talk about the principle of secularism. I believe there is a strong overlapping between these two principles, although I believe also that the principle of neutrality has a larger range of operation than secularism that is connected only with the issue of politics and religion. The problem is, as was quite clear in recent writings by Habermas and other people, that the believer's situation after a decision based on the principle of neutrality is not fair. It's not as fair as the unbeliever's decision. And this is why probably we find in some of the last works by Habermas a different direction from the one that he used to give in his more well-known works, such as Facts and Norms, the big works of the past. Now, what is the case of the crucifix, first of all? Because I'm going on with this speech without introducing it. It's very easy to describe as far as facts are concerned. It happened that in a school of a little town of Veneto, the children of a woman who was married to an Italian, but she was not Italian. This is not an irrelevant fact. She was Finnish. And the children of this woman used to attend a school in the classroom, as in all other classrooms, on the walls where there was hanging the crucifix.
Public school.
A public school. It is quite common all over the country. And she disagreed with this crucifix hanging on the wall. And she asked applied to the authorities of the school, first of all, in order to remove the crucifix. And of course they rejected the application. Then she went to different levels of the judicial system, and the administrative courts had their opinions. The decisions were mostly against the application. They crucifix as a legitimate object hanging on the wall. There are some issues that are not relevant for our discourse here, such as the legal authority that is having something such as royal decrees of 1924-26 that stated the obligation of crucifix on all classroom walls, and they were still valid at that time. But this is not an issue that concerns us here. One of the most relevant steps of this path is the fact that the Corte di Cassazione, as I told you before, decided that the crucifix was illegitimate because it denied the principle of secularism that had to be observed all over Italy, that belonged to the Italian Constitution, or at least this is what they maintain. Finally, the issue was decided in front of the Court of Justice, the Court of the European or Human Rights of Europe. And the funny thing is that there were two judgments. The first in front of the Chamber, and the second in front of the Grand Chamber, that is the last level in Europe. You cannot go further than that. The Chamber decided against the crucifix. The Grand Chamber decided in favor of the crucifix, but not because they wanted to put forward substantial issues. They, in a way, I have to say, using an old image, decided such as Pontius Pilate used to do. That is, they said it's something that belongs to the discretionality of the state. So it's something that Italy has to decide. We have also to notice one other thing. They were the years of this is a political consideration, the years of the center-right government, the Berlusconi years. I don't know if this decision would have come out differently in Italy under a different kind of political majority. Now, one thing that may be interesting for the development of the argument here is the kind of arguments that were put forward by the advocates of the state and the ones that the defenders of this issue, and by some of the courts. In a way, they use, I would say, sort of communitarian arguments, because they were more than one. One of them was the crucifix is a symbol of historical and cultural development, and therefore of the identity of the Italian people. So a question of identity. Second argument, the crucifix is a symbol of the value system that underpins the Italian Constitution: liberty, equality, human dignity, and religious toleration. Third argument, studying history, we can perceive an affinity between the hardcore of Christian values, including charity, liberty, and acceptance of difference, and the hardcore of the Republican Constitution, which attaches value to the freedom of all. Finally, as an historical, the idea of supporting this decision, there is the argument that as an historical guide for reflection, the crucifix is not concerned with the freely held convictions of anyone, excludes no one, and of course does not impose or prescribe anything. So that there is no active imposition. Having a crucifix hanging on the walls is not something that is close to proselytization, if the word is correct, and it is a sort of active impingement on people's decision on the freedom of conscience. And so what I'm trying to do here is not only to discuss this case from the point of view of several liberal authors that are the ones that I presented, and so taking different views about the principle of neutrality, but also to propose an alternative that might be conceived as a way of tackling this issue. That is a sort of liberal perfectionist alternative. The basic idea is that it's not something that has to be played only on the political level. Political public reason, the principle of neutrality, and political perfectionism on the other side are principles that are played on the political level. That is, what the state should or should not do towards certain activities of its citizens. Promotion or non-promotion of certain activities, eventually or intrinsically, if there is anything of this sort. I also believe that together with this political side, what should be considered and usually tends to be neglected is the personal point of view. I used to distinguish, obviously following a long tradition, between a political perfectionism and a personal perfectionism. The personal perfectionism has to do with the point of view of the individual. How, well, to use a well-known question, how should I live, was asked to Socrates at the beginning of Plato's Republic. That is the beginning of Plato's ethics, probably I would say also of Greek, ancient Greek ethics. And I believe that all of Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics is a development from the basic question. Once we conceive an issue of this sort, such as the crucifix, that has to do with the life of believers who are concerned about these issues, we should also consider the problem from the personal point of view. This is something that for me is important to be taken into consideration, and I am emphasizing this point because usually it tends to be neglected. Usually the discussion that concerns neutrality and perfectionism is a political discussion. There is no relevance conferred at the so-called personal level, the level of the individual life. Now, one other thing that might puzzle you, at least a few of you, is what is perfectionism, that I have been naming several times, because while the principle of neutrality is quite more well known, probably most of you have already had some acquaintance with it, the perfectionism is something less well known. And there is by now quite a large literature on this issue. And one thing that I will start with is that quite paradoxically, perfectionism seems to be a label that is being attached to this body of ideas by somebody who was not a perfectionist. It started to enter, I believe, and Erin, you can correct me, it started to enter into the debate, especially after 1971, that is after Rawls, who was talking about perfectionism as being one of the set of ideas that he was just setting aside. He was not interested in perfectionism, and he was the starter, the main starter of the theory that carried forward to the principle of neutrality and its explication, and later to public reason. But perfectionism, he was talking just about perfectionism, is something that has been introduced by somebody who may be called an enemy of perfectionism, using a strong word, of course. Rawls took perfectionism to be, by and large, the maximization of human acceptance. He was not distinguishing between the political and the personal level. And I believe that considering the variety of authors that have contributed to perfectionism, and I Latin freedom, was one of the main supporters of a variety of perfectionism, the autonomy-oriented perfectionism, and we have other people such as Thomas Gurka or George Scherer. To some degree, also, some of the arguments developed by Robert Nozick in philosophical explanations are the perfectionist kind. And finally, we have something that I would attract your attention and recommend to you reading because it's coming out in a few months. That is a book by Matthew Kramer, the Cambridge legal and political philosopher, and that's called Liberalism with Acceptance. It's not out yet, but it's going to be out in the next month. And he's taking again, reconciling and reproposing the perfectionist argument in a way that is, as it always happens with this kind of debate, it's a response to a previous writer who was supporting Rawls' thesis and restating the principle of neutrality by Rawls in a persuasive way. I'm talking about Jonathan Kwon, who in 2010, in another book called, I believe, Liberalism Without Perfection, strongly supported the principle of neutrality against perfectionism. His target of attack was perfectionism. And so Kramer is again trying to restate the perfectionist argument by a view that he calls aspirational perfectionism. It's the idea basically that the state does not need to improve directly the lives of people, does not have to go to the maximization of human acceptance straightforwardly as Rawls was thinking, but the state may be content just with improving what he calls the stature of society in order to, yes, he uses this word that sounds strange to me as well, but the idea is to improve indirectly lives of individuals by improving the stature of society. And so, by and large, I believe that we can talk about perfectionism when we have something that, some sort of set of ideas aimed at improving. I would talk about offering, a critical potential about the improvement of human nature in some ways, however you want to consider. And so it's something that is aimed at a better human development. This is something that can be controversial, but that I believe that there are several ways we can try to solve this kind of problem, but it is not something I'm concerned with now. The other point that is relevant here is, in introducing the issue, what is the connection between the crucifix case and perfectionism? Because the first question might be, what does it matter to have a crucifix hanging on the wall for a perfectionist kind of life, human life? And the idea is that for a certain set of people, the believers, their religious experience and their self-realization and being recognized, their self-recognition and at the same time being recognized by having a public recognition, being recognized by the state and by their society as believers, and so the possibility of a display of their religious symbols, of having celebrations and festivities and whatever, are important signs of their believers' life. So it's something that should deny a part of their experience of life, of the way they can realize themselves. So the idea is that at a sort of low level, we should have the opportunity as believers of having a recognition of our life and of what we believe in at a public level. It's to say the principle of neutrality, that if applied strongly and thoroughly, would entail not a fair treatment of the believers, of a group of people, the believers in whatever religion you want to. Because the principle of neutrality in this case wouldn't be entirely neutral. It would recognize the reasons of the unbelievers, because all religious symbols are taken off, taken out of the classrooms or any other public place. And so the unbelievers would be content, but all of the believers would be in a sort of inferior situation. They wouldn't receive a fair treatment. And at this point, I believe that Habermas' contribution is very relevant, because he was recognizing that believers are denied an important part of their identity if there is no possibility of translating their reasons into a public discourse. So he was pushing against this sort of, I think he calls it epistemical asymmetry, that is the impossibility for believers to explain themselves, to bring into the public debate reasons as well as in the same way that the unbelievers can do. So he was pushing towards a sort of recognition by unbelievers, by the state, by public reason, so to say, of the believers' reason. He was encouraging, promoting some steps from the political side towards the believers' reasons, something that had been denied so far, because the dominating understanding of public reason was the Rawls' first line of understanding. That is the idea that in the political forum we can bring only reasons that can be spent in public, that can be used in a political, in a public forum, and they are reasons that also other people can understand. Some kinds of reasons of this sort should be excluded. I'm not talking about what can converge into the so-called overlapping consensus. I'm talking about other sets of reasons, such as those that derive from typical Christian issues, so to say. For example, the idea of transcendence, of the resurrection, the life after life. These kind of ideas are cut off in a typical Rawls-style political form. But talking about Rawls, I also believe that there is some degree of recognition of this sort of reasons and this sort of understanding, so to of the world, let's say the world vision of the believers. When he uses concepts such as the background culture of society, when he uses the concept of background culture of society that comes in political liberalism, that is more than 20 years after the theory of justice, or when he uses the concept of the inclusive view, is gesturing towards a kind of reasons that are usually excluded from the political debate. Though it's a kind of reasons that are important for the people that want to use them, and so some degree of recognition should be conferred to these reasons. This is the basic idea that I believe is behind these two concepts, again, the background culture of society and the inclusive view, although they are different between each other, but there is a common line, I believe. I've already said something about Habermas, so the basic idea is a sort of cognitive opening. This is what Habermas is pushing toward, having a cognitive opening to the believer's reasons. And in these cases, in Rawls' case, but especially in Habermas' case, I would say that we are introduced to a sort of different understanding of the principle of neutrality. Especially in Habermas' case, I would talk, I would introduce, if it is possible, to make a sort of reconversion of the principle of neutrality, I would talk about a sort of tempered neutrality, especially in the case of Habermas, but I repeat, I believe that also Rawls was to some degree aware of the necessity of heading to some degree in this direction. The other theorists that I am discussing here have different points of view on this. Forst, Rainer Forst, is expanding through a set of writings, and especially one book, but also more very recent writings of his last years, what he calls the right to justification thesis, that is a sort of strict, in some way, strict or let's say unwavering Kantian proposal based on rights, the idea of rights as forms of non-domination. Human rights are forms of non-domination. What is basic is the idea of freedom, and he is rejecting any kind of interpretation of rights as based on ethical ideas, such as based on values or on conceptions of the good. He is discussing in one of his papers James Griffiths, the utilitarian Oxford-based philosopher, who is, on the contrary, supporting a view of rights as based on a conception of the good. Okay. What is interesting in Forst is that he expands on human rights, and the basic concept that is behind this conception is an idea of reciprocity. It's an idea of reciprocity that is also in line, of course, with Rawls and Habermas. And I believe that we can also devise one other thing that I haven't been dwelling on until now, and it's one of my mistakes in proposing this talk in a hurry, that is the idea of reasonableness. Reasonableness. The idea of reasonableness is central all over political and legal debate. Most of I'm going to talk about reasonableness again in the afternoon from another point of view, but it's not so far from what I'm saying here. So what I want to say is that there is, as a common ground among these authors, a view of reasonableness as reciprocity that is very clear in Rawls. It's a bit compromised in Habermas. It's again very clear in Forst, and it's again compromised to some degree in Ferrar's and Michael's views. Now, these are all sets of views. I am trying to refer just a few hints about them, and I invite you, if you have time to waste, to give a reading on the paper to get more information. What I can say about Ferrar and Michael is that they of course have differences between each other. But in a way, I believe that they agree on what they call the proposal of a dualist democracy in hyper-pluralism. The idea is, we live in time in which what Michael first and Ferrar later call occlusion of authorship and shortfall of agreement. These are two basic problems of our democratic age. Occlusion or authorship has to do with the problem of democratic legitimacy of many of our decisions at legislative levels because of the different kinds of ways of governance that goes out of the usual public government channel, and it's something that is very common, especially in Europe. That is the problem of the multinational powers. But there are different grounds to talk about this, to legitimize this idea of the authorship, while the shortfall of agreement has to do with what correctly Ferrar describes as hyper-pluralism. That is the idea that we live in a time in which peoples in our same territory, within the boundaries of our state, come from very different cultural experiences, have different sets of values to a degree that was unknown in the past. So we have more difficulty than we had in the past to find an agreement. So what is the possible solution? Obviously nothing is easy to find out, but surely one point on which both of them agree is the idea of the dualist democracy that was firstly introduced by Bruce Ackerman quite a while ago in the 90s, and the idea is to have two levels. The first level is the level of constitutional essentials, on which you should have a strict agreement and on which the observers cannot waver. While on the second level, that's more of a level of compromise and possibility of finding different sets of agreement concerning different conflicts. Now, there are so many things to be said on these two authors, but basically they are discussing between two poles. What Michael calls a philosophical pole and an originalist pole. The philosophical pole is where you tend to find solutions to difficult cases. One of the cases that is discussed is the famous Brown versus Board of Education. And so the idea is, can we find a philosophically oriented solution? A solution that comes from principles. I'm just about to finish. And of course, principles of justice. Or, like I said, should we also, to some degree, be constrained by what the law says, by an originalist understanding of the Constitution, of the values that are contained in the Constitution. So, they, by and large, tend to bridge, to build a bridge between these two poles, and they, to some degree, agree to a cognitive opening to what they call a post-secular conception of reasonableness. So, reasonableness, in their view, is something that gets to some degree away from what was the original roles, reciprocity-based understanding. Finally, I didn't have time enough to tell all that should be told about the perfectionist alternative, but one thing is that if we have a reasonable as reciprocity, as the exit point in terms of judicial and legal reasoning for the principle of neutrality, for the original view of public reason. On the other side, that is the perfectionist side, what we might also have is another alternative view of reasonableness. A view of reasonableness that is not based on reciprocity, is based following George Henry Wright's proposal several years ago on conceiving reasonableness as opposed to rationality, as something that is concerned with the right way of living. So, reasonable can be everything that has to do with the right way of living of individuals. It's quite a large understanding. I realize that I've been very incomplete, that I have said many things in a probably too fast way, and I apologize for the time being, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk, and we now have some 15 minutes time for discussion.
Michele, I appreciate it also. It was very useful. I have a question about the crucifix. Yes. Because the dialectic you are using, like Habermas and others, is believers versus non-believers. But with the crucifix, it's more complicated. Because there are believers, Christian believers, non-believers, and other believers that are the ones that are feeling most insulted by the crucifix. Jewish people, Islamic Muslims, and people of other religions. They think that this is an imposition of the majority on the minority. So it's not as simple as this has been framed. Because the solution there is, should we use only the crucifix, accepting the idea that we can, grant this display religious symbol? Why only the crucifix? Because the majority of people are Catholics or Christians or for some other reason. Because the alternative is that, let's have symbols of the different religions that are represented in a classroom, for example. And so these are different things. I don't think that that has to be addressed.
Yes. And actually, this is something that I left out, but I'm perfectly aware that there is this problem. The answer, the tentative answer, of course, is that we cannot have at the same time a display of all possible religious symbols. And the fact that a country has got a certain kind of religious tradition and a certain overwhelming, in the case of Italy, majority, may be an argument in favor of the display of certain religious symbols rather than others. This is one thing. The other thing is not a minor fact, what I addressed to you at the beginning. The case was not raised by a Muslim, by a Jew, or by a Buddhist.
Yeah, but there are other cases raised by them. This is the one that went public. There are other cases, right?
But I believe that there are no. I recall about other cases that were raised in the past but didn't go to the judicial level. For the simple reason that I believe that believers of other religions have a stronger sensibility to this question than unbelievers.
Yeah.
because they know that they are at least Muslims. Let's take the most relevant case in Italy at this moment. We have quite a large number of Muslims, and at this time, at least for the time being, they are not raising cases of this kind. They are not asking for removing Christian.
Besides the concrete legal case in Italy, what about in abstraction? Let's say that in 20 years there will be a more substantial, another substantial religion. So how big, in principle, what should we do when there are different general? You need not just to address the crucifix case, but being a political philosopher, the general case, yes. Right? So, well, let's assume that there is a classroom, and that happens, in which there are more children from Muslim. That happens now in Italy. There are more children from Muslim families than from Christian families. So, I'm not saying that I have an answer.
No, I agree. And on this point, I have to take a legal rather than a political philosopher point of view. Because one of the interesting sides of this concept, that is reasonableness within legal reasoning, is that it's very flexible. And what they call the balancing aspect of reasonableness is something that is relevant and important just because the balancing result can change from time to time. What is the result by which a court can decide a case of this kind, of this relevance, is dependent on the context, on the contextual circumstances of the case, and on the particulars of the case. 5 years from this case, things may change. 10 years from this case, or 15 years from this case, we may have, if things continue to go as they are going now, we may have a Muslim majority in this country. At that point, we are going to have the moon inside our classrooms. So, what I'm saying is that if we want to reach a reasonable solution, I believe that it is reasonable to talk about European Court of Human Rights as having decided in the right way in that moment, although not for the right arguments, I believe, because they might have used different arguments of the sort that I am trying to dig out. And it is something that may change, because one of the other sides of reasonableness is social acceptability. In order for a decision to be reasonable, it should be socially acceptable by the majority of the country, at least. This is why, in another famous, if I may add a little parenthesis, in another famous American case that is called Lochner versus State of New York, at the beginning of the 20th century, Justice Holmes might say the reasonable person might have decided this case differently, because the Lochner was decided in favor of the principle of liberty, the liberty of the entrepreneur to have his bakers working at the bakery more than 10 hours a day. And the majority of the Supreme Court said this is just application of the freedom of personal freedom as in the American Constitution. But then Justice Holmes, in the dissenting opinion, said the reasonable person might have decided differently because there are social welfare reasons in favor of the bakers. And he said that because he said that at that time already there was a growing social awareness of a good, I cannot say the majority, but at least a good part of the American population in favor of a better protection of the rights of the workers.
Okay, so my topic is the relationship between nationalism and normativity, and the idea there is that we have to reformulate an adequate version of naturalism that would welcome normative phenomena and other phenomena that regular naturalism is not able to. So there are three meta-philosophies I will briefly discuss. So the first one is just a complete refusal of naturalism. The second one is strict naturalism. So it's the idea that what exists and what can be known is told us by natural science. And the third one is liberal naturalism, is the bigger view about what nature is and what we can do and understand and what exists also. A good way of starting is a form of common sense realism that has been very common and is generally, even if not always, anti-naturalistic in general. Not always, but these are some people that, some philosophers of very different kinds that have been defending some form of common sense realism. So Aristotle and most of the Aristotelian tradition, Thomas Reid, common sense philosophy, William James, Pierre Bourrin, Moore, Strozen, Austin, and Husserl, Bergson, and Wittgenstein in some respects. These are all philosophers. Oh, you couldn't hear? Oh, okay. The first 3 minutes were interesting enough to tape it. These are all philosophers that in some sense defend the idea that common sense is crucial for understanding the reality of the world. So let's define an idealistic view of common sense realism. First, apart from special cases, perception, like optical illusions, perception gives us the opportunity to access the external world as it is. Okay? Second, observable objects really have the primary and secondary properties that, on the basis of perception, we tend to attribute to them. Okay? That's crucial because, as you know, the foundation of modern philosophy and science is that external objects do not have the secondary properties, colors, or sounds, or that we would attribute to them. Okay? And then middle-sized objects have properties that are not identical to whatever microphysical properties constitute them. Okay? So at least they are not identical. It can even be, for some of these philosophers, that we don't know anything about the microphysical properties of the bodies. Like this table exists as such, and is not identical to its components, whatever components there are. And finally, no description of a middle-sized object that only mentions the physical properties could account for the qualitative, functional, axiological, normative, or aesthetic properties of this physical object, or of this object. Okay? That's, I think, 4 theses that the common sense realist would share. This is one manifesto of common sense realism. Husserl crisis, where he writes, Galileo performed a surreptitious substitution of the mathematically substructured world of idealities for the only real world, which is actually given through perception, which is ever experienced and experienceable, our everyday life world. So there are 2 theses here. First, the world of perception is real. There are 3 theses. Second, Galileo substituted the reference to the properties of the perceptible world with the reference to the geometric properties of the world. Third thesis, only the world that we perceive through perception, we reconstruct through perception, is the only real world. And then he adds, the substitution was promptly passed on to his successors, Galileo's successors, the physicists, all succeeding centuries. So notice, it's not just common sense realism. It's not only saying that this table exists and it has the properties that we commonsensically would attribute to it. It's only also saying only those properties constitute the world. And he adds something like, the only world is the world of human experience. This is the only real world. And then he adds, in this world, value and meaning are real, and secondary qualities do belong to the external objects in which we would commonsensically locate them. Third, the life world is the forgotten meaning fundament of natural science. That is, the genealogical and conceptual fundament of natural science. So this is, there are two components of this thesis. Natural science and the worldview of natural science started by Galileo, and up to today. Genealogically started from the common sense view of the world, but also conceptually is still rooted in the common sense view of the world. And then, that's crucial, scientific concepts are mere idealizations with practical purposes, such as measurement and prediction, but do not refer to any unobservable reality. This is instrumentalism about natural science. So when natural science refers to black holes or atoms or fields, it's not referring to anything that exists out there. And the only thing that exists according to this view is that we should say it exists according to this view is what corresponds to the concept that we acquire through the senses. One could say, okay, this is Husserl, almost 1 century ago, and strongly anti-scientific in spirit. But there are other philosophers, very influential philosophers, who are not anti-scientific at all. And this is one of the most influential. Bas van Frassen is a famous philosopher of science who holds a very similar view. Bas Frassen writes, constructive empiricism is set squarely within a common sense realism that was foreign to much of the empiricist one parenthesis. Constructive empiricism is the thesis similar to a common sense realism. So we acquire the world through interactions with the world through the senses, and we reconstruct the world starting from what we notice, what we acquire through the senses. It's different from Hume or Locke or Berkeley empiricism. It's dramatically different because these are forms of idealism. Okay? Hume was an idealist. Berkeley was an idealist. In the sense that they took the sense data as the only reality. So famously, Hume refused to say that there are objects out, real objects out there. Our worldview is limited to what we perceive the sense data. There is nothing beyond the sense data. This is not a position that Van Frassen has. This empiricism is connected with doing science and a constructive approach, and this is what he says. In this light, the common basis, I assume, is language, in which references are problematic to trees and mountains, people and books. So middle sides and objects do exist as we perceive it. Okay? And this is crucial to our empirically adequate scientific theories, so theories that do perform by use of which we perform predictions, adequate predictions. Empirically adequate scientific theories that appeal to unobservable entities, atoms, black holes, or fields, may be useful and heuristic tools, but are not true descriptions of the world. So we cannot say that our theories that mention atoms, electrons, or black holes describe the world as it is. They are only tools, exactly what Husserl was saying. So this is another form of common sense realism defended by a very influential contemporary philosopher of science. Notice, I told you, both Husserl and Van Frassen, there are two theses concerning common sense realism. One is the object we perceive exist in the way that we imagine they exist through the senses. Okay? They have the properties that we would attribute to them commonsensically, basing our ideas on the perceptions we have of this world. First thesis. Second thesis, this is the only real world. Okay? So I call this hyper common sense realism. And he says, when natural science, this is just a summary of it. When natural scientists appeal to unobservable entities and properties, they go wildly beyond what perception tells us about the external world. We don't have any direct perception of the atoms, of course. So an anti-realist attitude should be assumed towards the unobservable entities posited by the natural sciences, such as electrons, radiations, and black holes. Summarizing, hyper common sense realism, the common sense world that we acquire through the world is real, and it is the only real world. Now, I think that this is wrong. This has bad consequences, I think. Bad consequences because it devaluates what science and the sciences tell us about the world and give us a unilateral view of reality. I'm not happy with that. And there are good arguments to be unhappy. One good argument, famous argument, comes from one of the greatest philosophers of the last decades, Hilary Patton, is the so-called no-miracles argument, according to which we have one fact to explain. How is that the science that Galileo started is so successful in making predictions, to the point that we, send people to the moon? How is this possible? And the only possibility for Patton is that these theories, the theories on which base these predictions, are true or correct or approximately true. And so what these theories tell us about the world is more or less a description of what is out there. This is how the argument is more precisely defined. No attack on the... Also, there is... I don't have time to discuss several attacks on this argument. I repeat, the argument is the only way of explaining why science, physical sciences work so well, even when they refer to unobservable entities like atoms, is that these theories are true or approximately true. Otherwise, their success would be a miracle. How could we account for the fact that our theories in quantum mechanics make it possible for us to build things like the machine that take us to the moon, or machine that go on Mars? How would this be possible? It would be a miracle, right? If a false theory would make it possible for us to reach the moon and Mars. So we have to take these theories as more or less true. And so this argument justifies scientific realism. And so just this argument, right? No miracles argument. So scientific realism is justified, and we have a good argument to assume that the unobservable entities postulated by physical theories, and not only physical, biology and theories, are true, like the humans, right? It's not that we see. So scientific realism is justified versus what hyper common sense realism was saying. And there is also another reason to be a realist about science. Let me briefly give a hint here. Nowadays, there is a form of realism that is more moderate than traditional realism. So the traditional realism is, like in Patton, there are atoms out there that have the paradoxical properties that quantum mechanics attribute to them. There are objects with some properties. And then there is another view nowadays called structural realism, according to which our best theories do not describe the intrinsic nature of the phenomena or the entities. It's not that we know the atoms as such, we only know the network or relations in which this that structure an unobservable reality. So it's a deeply anti-Leibnizian theory. As you may remember, Leibniz has this idea, right? There are only intrinsic properties, no relational properties. Every monad is a universe in itself. This is the opposite. There is no monad, there are only relations. Okay? And there are two forms. One is the so-called epistemic structural realism. So the fact that we only know the relational properties out there, the network of relational properties, is based on our ignorance. And the second one is more radical. There are no unobservable objects out there. There are no atoms as such, as entities. There are only relations, okay, structures. So this is an ontological thesis. Anyway, I was stressing this because this is very fashionable and justifiably so in philosophy of science. So it's a more moderate form of realism, but still a form of realism. So there are good arguments to think that our, quantum theories or theory of relativity can be taken for true, even if they should be interpreted in this more moderate sense. So they talk about the real text. So the hybrid common sense realism is ungrounded in this sense. Well, the only problem is that many people take this scientific realism as an invitation to become very intolerant toward common sense realism, and I don't agree with it. This is, let's call it, sometimes I call it in the past with my colleague David McCarthy, I have been, and also with Hilary Patton, we have been working on these things. I call them, we call them scientific naturalism, but this is a little ambiguous. So let's call it strict naturalism. And this is the idea based on three. I'm refusing this conception. I think it's too restrictive. So there is an ontological tenet, according to which reality consists of nothing more than the entities to which the successful explanations of the natural sciences commit us. And this means only, for example, the mathematical properties of objects, not the qualitative properties of objects, not the secondary qualities of person. Epistemological tenet, there is an epistemological tenet, since scientific inquiry is our only genuine source of knowledge. All the other potential sources of knowledge or alleged forms of knowledge, like a priori knowledge, phenomenological knowledge, introspection, or conceptual analysis, are either reducible to, in principle, to scientific knowledge, or are just plainly illegitimate. And third, there is a metaphilosophical tenet. Philosophy has to be continuous to science, natural science, as to its contents, methods, and purposes. This is a very strong view. And I discussed two very important philosophers who have defended in different degrees this view. The first one is Quine. This is a quotation from Quine. So the first one is just a view that most philosophers accept nowadays. Nothing happens in the world, not the flutter of the eyelid, not the flicker of a thought, without some redistribution of microphysical states. So there is, in principle, a quantum mechanics account of what happened at the macro level. And then he adds, full coverage in this sense is the very business of physics. This sense is the explanation of everything that happens in reality. The full coverage in this sense is the very business of physics and only of physics. This is the symmetric opposite thesis to Husserl and Van Frassen once. Whereas for Husserl and Van Frassen, the sense of perception tells us are the only parameter to understand what exists. For Quine, the only parameter is what physics tells us to exist. And famously, he derived an ontological criteria for that. What exists is what is assumed, has to be assumed in the ontology of our best scientific theories. So Adams insists that values do not. Minds are something that is not entirely reduced to brains and do not exist, and so on. This is one view, but it's not even the most radical. The most radical has been expressed by another influential philosopher, Wilfrid Sellars. Sellars, and that's very interesting, was indirectly influenced by Husserl through his teacher, Marvin Farber, at the Buffalo where he studied. So he says, Marvin Farber introduced me to Husserl. And so Farber's combination of utter respect for the structure of Husserl's thought with equally firm conviction that this structure could be given a naturalistic interpretation was undoubtedly a key influence on my own subsequent philosophical strategy. What is the point that Sellars is stressing? This one. He accepts the genealogical thesis of Husserl. So, with Husserl, he thinks that there is a manifest image in consistent way, the common sense image in the world, and there is a scientific image. The second one derives from the first. But whereas Husserl thinks that the manifest image, the common sense image in the world, gives us a view of the reality, Sellers and Weber thinks the opposite. Only the scientific view tells us about reality. So this is the big difference. But the division starts from Husserl. And they inherit from Husserl the idea that you have to choose one of these two views. Common sense view, you are either realist about common sense or you are realist about science. And they make the opposite choice. They only are realist about science. Even when science talks about it, are not so. So this is what he writes. This is perhaps his most famous quotation. Speaking as a philosopher, I'm quite prepared to say that the common sense world of physical objects in space and time is unreal. That is, that there are no such things. So there are no trees, there are no books. So remember what Van Frasman said, right? I believe in the existence of books, trees, people. These things do not exist if we do philosophy. Practical life, let's keep maintaining the idea that we exist. But we know that we do not exist when we do philosophy. Only others exist. Okay? Or to put it less paradoxically, that is in the dimension of describing and explaining the world. Science is the measure of all things, of what it is that it is and what is not that it is not. So a new Protagorean view, if you remember, Protagoras said that man is the measure of all things, and he says now, says science is the measure of all things. The result of this view is what another famous philosopher, John Searle, has called the overriding question in contemporary philosophy. What is the overriding question? How can we square a conception of ourselves as mindful, meaning creating free, rational, etc. agents with a universe that consists entirely of mindless, meaningless, unfree, non-rational, brute physical particles? This is a new form of foundationalism, of course, the way in which Sellers interprets it. But some of you could be reminded of Kant's third antinomy in the Critique of Pure Reason, when Kant says, on the one side, I think I'm free. On the other side, I see that freedom in the natural world is impossible. What should I do? This is a reformulation. And these are the people who really defend this form of strict nationalism, that is a form of hyper-scientific realism. So because he says only science, microphysics, especially microphysics, tells us what exists. Patricia and Paul Churchland, people that wrote the famous Canberra Plan that has a credo that is a parody of the Christian credo, and says that only subatomic entities exist and these things. Hartsfield, Michael David, these are important philosophers who really believe in this form of hyper-scientific realism. Let's stress now some criticism. Let me summarize a point. As I said, there is one tendency, Van Frasman and Husserl, there is only the reality that the senses tell us exists, the common sense reality. And these other philosophers, Quine and Sellers and many others, say there is only the reality that physics and perhaps even only microphysics tell us about. Okay? So, where should we put all the things that Sellers was mentioning, meaning value, consciousness? Where are they? This is called the placement, but also a misplacement problem. This is another famous philosopher, Tyler Birch. This is 24 years ago, but still is true. The flood of projects that attempt to fit mental causation or mental ontology into a naturalistic picture of the world strike me as having more in common with political or religious ideology than with a philosophy that maintains perspective on the difference between what is known and what is speculated. So he's saying these people assume that the only world that there is the one of physics, and so they assume that the reality, all the other features of reality or alleged features of reality are either reducible to the physical world or just false, illusory. So this is about normativity. What happens with normativity, about normative facts in this scenario? Normativity, in general, concerns what we should or ought to do. I don't know, we should respect and our evaluations of things or state of affairs. These are what we would think, when we think at the common sense level, what normative facts are. So these are some sentences that express potentially these facts. One ought to keep one's promise. If one accepts P, and if P, then Q, one ought to accept Q, and Mozart was a better musician than Salieri. These are normative facts. These are sentences that express normative facts. But what happens with these facts? In the scientific realist point of view, what happens is that these sentences don't describe normative facts at all. Here is a quotation by another philosopher that I think is in the right way. This is John McDowell. He writes, "Modern science understands its subject matter in a way that threatens, at least, to leave it disenchanted. The world is left disenchanted by modern science and philosophy as in scientific realism. The subject matter, so the world as it's left to us by modern science threatens at least to leave it disenchanted, as Weber put the point in an image that has become a commonplace. So disenchantment of the world that was accomplished by modern science, something that Husserl also referred to. The image marks a constant between two kinds of intelligibility. The kind that is sought by, as we call it, natural science, the kind we find in a phenomenon when we see it as governed by natural law. So a human being, when it's described as an object that moves according to the laws of physics. And the kind we find in something when we place it in relation to other occupants of the logical space of reasons. The kind of intelligibility that is proper to meaning. So there are two ways of looking at the world. This is very Kantian, right? Two ways of looking at the world. The way of science and the way which belong to the space of reason. This is a form of Kantianism without normativity. A form of Kantianism in which there are two ways of describing the world. Now, certainly McDowell is a realist about common sense, and there is at least one passage in which he says that he's a realist about science also, even if this is not what he cares about the most. I think this can be easily expanded in that direction. So the problem that we have with the hyper-scientific view of the world is the placement problem. What should one think about the features of the common sense view of the world that do not fit into the scientific view? This is how we are left to take the disenchantment of the world in a radical way, as Quine and Sellers and many others did. Whereas the normative phenomena, free will, self-consciousness, phenomenological properties, the quality, right? What happened? Collective intentionality. What is this phenomenon? What is the physical equivalent or correlate of collective intentionality? Is there a way of accounting for this phenomenon if we only consider the natural properties, the properties that natural science studies? This is an example that comes from Barry Smith. There are two Barry Smith. This is the one in Buffalo. Financial debts. We talk about financial debts all the time, but what is the physical correspondent? There is nothing physical there, right? If you're a strict physicalist, you could try to go to your bank and say, you know what about my debts? They do not exist, because there is no way of accounting for them in physicalistic terms. Try this technique. Good luck. Mathematical truths. That's interesting because even Quine had to admit that abstract entities exist because they are an essential part of physics. So, and this is strange because abstract entities exist in a very different way from the way in which atoms exist. Some other people, like Hartfield, are much more radical there and say that mathematical truths do not exist at all. And mathematical entities do not exist at all. And so, according to Hartfield, that is very consistent. It's a radical, strict naturalist, a very consistent strict naturalist. 2 + 2 is 4 is as true as Oliver Twist was born in London. So it's true in a story, but it's not true objectively. And there are many other things. And so strict naturalism encompasses an imperialistic version of scientific realism, what I call hyper scientific realism. And so my idea, and Patlam and McDowell and many others, idea is to shape a different form of naturalism. Liberal naturalism. I'm almost done. How many minutes?
Some 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, so let's see the three tenets as we could reformulate them. If you want to be open to both common sense realism and scientific realism, if you want to encompass these two forms of reality, alleged forms of reality together. So first, we need a liberalized ontological tenet. Some real entities exist that are irreducible to, but not incompatible with, the entities that are part of the coverage domain of a science-based ontology. A complicated way of saying, besides atoms, there are also middle-sized objects. They are real. And they have the properties that they tend to have the properties, sometimes we could be wrong, but they tend to have the properties that commonsensically we attribute to them. Liberalized epistemological tenet, some legitimate forms of understanding, prior reasoning, introspection, or conceptual analysis, are neither reducible to scientific understanding nor incompatible with it. Third, liberalized metaphilosophical tenet. There are cases in which philosophy is not continuous with science for content purposes or the method. In some cases, I think it is. There are very interesting projects in philosophy concerning, for example, philosophy of physics or what quantity science tells us about the world, but that doesn't mean that philosophy has to be continuous with science all the time. I think this is just a dogma. So let me give 3 metaphysical remarks. So I think that there are a pluralistic ontology. So I think there are, of course, because I believe both in the ontology of common sense and the scientific ontology. First, between the macroscopic and the microphysical world, I think there is a relation of covariance. I think it's possible that when something happens at the macro level, something happens at the macro level, something happens at the micro level. So for example, if we repaint this, and this has a different color, there is a physical structure that has been changed. Notice, I only talk about covariance, I don't talk about supervenience. I'm talking about the supervenience. Because supervenience, as is normally interpreted, is not just a relation of covariance, it's a relation of ontological dependence, generally intended from the macro world to the macro. And I think that sometimes things can go the other side, the other direction. Then the properties of the macroscopic world depend in some sense for their existence on the existence of the properties of the scientific world. This is about existence, but I'm a little, this has to be defined well, it's complicated. But anyway, there is some form of dependence that has to be said that doesn't tell us the whole truth about things. And then there is that's more interesting, it's a notion of constitution of the macroscopic world from the physical world. It's not a relation of identity, it's only a relation of constitution. So, I don't know if you know semantic externalism. There was someone I was discussing last time, we were discussing semantic externalism. So the idea is that when we refer to the world, we also refer, because of our causal interaction with the world, to the microphysical structure of the world. But this is not a reduction of meaning to causal relationship. Anyway, the idea is that it's complicated, I don't have time to address this, but the idea is that when we refer to tables, cabbages, and prime ministers, we refer to something that really exists and is composed of physical properties of entities. Okay? There is a notion of composition here. Last remarks, and that's I was very sloppy about that, but there is no science itself, natural science, even physics is very varied in its scope. There is no one ontology, one methodology of science. Science is very complicated. So scientific monism in ontology and epistemology is just wrong. There's a lot of variation. Also, I think there are excellent reasons for using the liberalized ontological criteria. So taking the Quine pattern criteria, that one is more liberal on that. So we take our best theories about the world and we accept their ontology. But our best theories are not only physical theories. They could be, for example, common sense theories, so they could be philosophical theories, they could be social science theories, and many other, even the arts sometimes tell us something true about us. So we learn something about human beings sometimes, more from a Greek novel than from, physiological book. This is important, I cannot stress it enough. Causal pluralism is very interesting here. Causality is normally taken in this way, in this analytic circles. There are causal forms, I can produce effects in the world, but all actually is reducible to physical causation. I think this is not true. I think that we should defend forms of causality, which causality, as Patin said, is connected with explanation. So our causal, when we see causal relations in the world, is because we are actually explaining phenomena from a particular point of view. And there are different ways of explaining phenomena. So let me give a brief, I'm almost done, but a brief example. So a person has a stroke, and we should decide why this person. And we say because. Now, as John Haldane wrote once, there are as many becauses as becauses. So we can say the person had a stroke. If you ask a physiologist, they would say, had a stroke because this happened to the blood circulation. And that's one answer. It's a legitimate if we have some particular interest, if you are in a medical, in a hospital. But if you ask, why did this person had a stroke to the insurance agent? He said, oh, of course he had a stroke because he didn't take his medicines. Or we could ask his family, and they could say, oh, he had a stroke because he ate so many lasagna last night. Or, if he survived, we could say, oh, I had a stroke because I didn't do my exercise for 2 months, or whatever. These are all good explanations. They are legitimate. They may all be true at the same time. No one has priority over the others. So there is a relation between, a strict relation between, my view, between explanation and causation. This doesn't make causation just an idealistic or subjective notion. I think there are different causal chains in the world. There is no priority of physical causality. It's important. This comes from Aristotle. There are different ways of describing what is out there in causal terms. And then we ideally should find a reflective equilibrium between all these forms of description of reality, because I think they describe reality. Common sense describes reality, and scientific science describes reality. There are, of course, sometimes conflicts. For example, I'm interested in the free will issue. There are conflicts, of course, but we have to be careful and understand what we are discussing at the time. There is no one free will issue. There are many ways in this issue can be addressed. In some sense, science is relevant. In some sense, science has the last word. In some others, doesn't actually matter much. So it depends what we are discussing. And so I strongly defend an idea of pluralism. Thank you very much.
Those of you who haven't been here in the morning, I will again introduce Michele Mangini to you, who will do the talk in this second part of the workshop. Well, Michele Mangini graduated in law at the University of Bari in 1985 with a thesis in sociology of law. Between 1987 and 1997, he was visiting Yale Law School, NYU Law School, Oxford University, Suor Orsola Benincasa Institute in Naples, and Harvard University, and graduated in 2004 with a PhD thesis on the good life in liberal state at Sussex University. Oh, yeah, you can read what I'm just telling you. Okay, okay. Started teaching sociology at the law school at the University of Bari in 2002, and has been teaching political philosophy as associate professor since 2005, and he's currently teaching the ethics and law and philosophy of law at the same time place. His research interests are in the field of economic analysis of law and applied ethics, in particular environmental ethics, and more recently in central issues on liberal theory, legal reasoning, and especially with a focus on some elements of Aristotelian philosophy. I have also 3 selected works you can see there. 2005, Il liberalismo forte per un'etica pubblica perfezionista. 2009, Diritto naturale e liberalismo. And 2010, Ethics of Virtue, Perfectionism in Natural Law. His talk today will be about dimensions of legal reasonableness. And we will now just try to start the PowerPoint presentation.
Yes. Thank you, Marcus, for the presentation again, and sorry for people that were here in the other classroom in the morning because they've been twice listening the same thing. And thank you again to Professor Gabriele De Anna for the invitation. In this afternoon, I'm going to present this set of reflections which come out of a larger work on reasonableness. We've been talking to some degree also about reasonableness in the morning, but today we're going obviously to look at the issue more in detail. And having said this by way of introduction, now, can you hear me properly? Okay, good. In case you have problems with the way the argument develops, just let me know during the exposition. Okay, so what is reasonableness? Why is it important? Reasonableness is a basic concept in contemporary legal and political theory. And it is a complex concept, a concept that has a variety of dimensions and a variety of meanings. It is very surprising sometimes to look at how many different meanings courts, I'm talking about the highest courts in Italy, in Germany, all over the place, in the Supreme Court, in the States, how many meanings have been assigned to this term. And it is a variety of meanings and of better, I would say, dimensions that ranges between epistemology and ethics, law and politics. Epistemology and ethics I would include the last 3 categories, ethics, law, and politics together. They are all
Normative.
Yeah, they're all normative and belonging, let's say, yes, to the realm of practical philosophy, while with the epistemology we are in another context. I'm not dealing with the epistemological context here, just with the first 3, that of course is more than enough. And one of the first problems is just to start with a semantic inquiry into this variety of uses. And a semantic inquiry that regards judicial uses, because most of the problems come from this set of meanings that have been put forward by courts in all these countries I've been telling you about. We are led to try to find a common thread, to give at least some set of ideas that, let's say, a minimal common denominator that can make sense of all these different understandings. And this goes through both civil law and common law. It is a concept that makes it's used and it's so persuasively used both in a context of common law and in one of civil law, and both in public and in private law. It's a necessary point of reference once we deal with the law and with normativity. It's something that just cannot be escaped anymore in the realm of the law and in the realm of politics, as we are soon going to see after Rawls' public reason. The most recent, let's say the 93 Rawls, and what follows, that is the Rawls of political liberalism, is an author that is concerned with public reason and with ideas that come, let's say, from this large domain of reasonableness. But some of these reflections are aimed towards what I call a philosophy of reasonableness that is inspired more than by Rawls, by Aristotle, and by von Wright's appeal to Aristotle. And he proposes a different understanding of the concept, that marks a point of difference with Rawls' public reason, and maybe through von Wright's understanding we may reach a notion that is more attuned with the variety of uses of contemporary society. Why there is such a big variety of understandings? It depends, of course, on what is being called by some authors, some commentators, its multifacetedness. It's a different meanings in legal theory that address a variety of important issues, and issues that are often brought to the attention of the courts. There is also a reasonableness in legislation, and some authors are concerned with reasonable laws and the evaluation of these reasonable laws, because one of the points, the crucial points, is that when we speak about reasonableness, we speak about an evaluative notion, a normative notion, so it's an evaluative notion, and it's something that in a way for some aspects brings back to the law those moral notions that legal positivism has tried to expel for more than 1 century. However, I will not be concerned with reasonableness in legislation, but only in adjudication. And I already said that there is a large number of course opinions. I already said that also this practice of adjudication that uses the notion of reasonableness is something that belongs especially to Supreme Courts, to the top level courts, both in civil law and in common law. There is a large, just because we are talking in Italy, there is a large jurisprudence by the Constitutional Court of Italy using the concept of reasonableness. And so the idea is that some sort of systematic understanding that weaves together with these apparently disconnected threads may be legally and socially rewarding. I believe it's not the case that we are always using the same word, the same concept, that is reasonableness. Although I would be here, and this is another caution, I would be here talking mainly about the principle of reasonableness, that is an objective notion of reasonableness, while there is also the subjective variant, that is the so-called standard of the reasonable person, that is so much used in the common law, and of which we also have an example in our law, because in the Italian law, I don't know how many of you are familiar with law here, we have the standard of the diligenza del buon padre di famiglia. I don't know if you've ever heard about it, but that's exactly what I'm talking about. When they talk in private law, in tort law, about the reasonable person, they are aiming at a notion that is very similar to the one that we use
Padre
here.
di famiglia, perhaps you should explain, is the...
Padre di famiglia is like saying that the good father of the family.
That's the privileged point of view, the man.
It's another way of expressing the same content that is in the reasonable person, at least at the beginning. Now maybe things are evolving. So the sketch of the philosophy of reasonableness that I shall try to put forward is a normative theory with an implicit ethical vision that ranges more widely than Rawls's public reason. It is an ethical vision that, this is my contention, turns better on the right way of living, as von Wright says, rather than on Rawls's idea of public reason. I mean, the idea of connecting reasonableness as a overarching meaning, overarching content of meaning to the right way of living is something that can be more fruitful on the way of this generality of interpretation that we are dealing with. And given the complexity of this notion, what I'll try, although very quickly, and I apologize for that, but I am pushed by the time schedule, it's trying to deal with the concept on three different levels of analysis, and they are of concepts that I try to oppose: descriptive versus normative, objective versus subjective, normativity versus structure. The second one, objective versus subjective, I can anticipate, is something that I already put forward on the ground. That is, the subjective side is the reasonable person. I will not be dealing with that here, so forget it. And if you want to hear about it, I can give you more instructions of reading. I'll be dealing to some degree on the first, that is the opposition descriptive and normative, because I start with what is a semantic, an attempt of semantic analysis in some of the uses of this term by judicial, by the courts, by especially civil law courts in this case. And the third opposition, normativity versus structure, is something that will come out at the end. Mainly, I am concerned with the normative problem of reasonableness, although there is an important part of this problem that is connected with the structure of reasonableness. And so, in the end, it will come out an attempt of analysis. Now, part of this semantic analysis that concerns some opinions from different courts, you find in the papers that you've been reading, I suppose, or anyway you've been given for reading for this meeting here. And so, first we find the use of reasonableness as logic or equality. As, for example, it emerges from an opinion of the highest Italian administrative court, the Consiglio di Stato, that with regard to an issue of an amnesty for the unlawful construction of houses, observed that houses built infringing the same rules over the same period cannot be subject to different fines. Of course, there was a problem, there had been a problem of different treatment of houses that had been infringing rules, probably rules concerning building of in a certain area, and they had been subjected to different fines, so they've been treated differently. But there was no reason for this different treatment. So one of the basic understanding of reasonableness is equality of treatment, that the courts sometimes call logic, although this doesn't correspond with what we commonly think about logic. And we can think also about this understanding of reasonableness as coherence. Coherence to be shaped in terms of the principle of equality, treat like cases alike, and treat dissimilar cases dissimilarly. An extensive jurisprudence of the Italian Constitutional Court and administrative courts rely on the logical principle of treating like cases alike. Another judicial use is consistency. There is this big corporation, the Monsanto Corporation, at the beginning of the new millennium, reacted against a national, an Italian, and European. They had two different bans on the introduction of GMOs, genetically modified organisms. Not only a panel set up by the European Commission established that the Italian ban was arbitrary because not based on a proper assessment of risks, but also an administrative judge in a parallel dispute considered inadequate the preliminary process of investigation of relevant facts. So there had not been a proper assessment of risks. There was no a proper investigation of the relevant facts, and the the judicial review of this case, of course, was negative for the Italian law, the Italian ban. And this is one of the other basic meanings, is the meaning of proportionality, a concept that originated in German doctrine and was later imported into European law by the European Court of Justice. The basic idea is that a public authority must not only weigh public and private interests, but must also choose measures that imply the least burden on the private interests as state. So it's a sort of, also we might say, means and relation. We should try to choose the correct means to reach a certain end, and this means should put the least possible burden on the private interests as state. So there must be a proportion between the aim, the end that is searched by the state, and the means that are adopted and employed in the application of that end. The ECJ, the European Court of Justice, established case law reveals that proportionality is basically a matter of balancing, but not only. It involves a three-stage test: checking for fitness, necessity, proportionality in a strict sense. Now, it is interesting to notice that balancing is something that belongs especially to the common law language. In judicial use, in common law, you find mainly balancing. You don't find any discourse about proportionality. But partly they are talking about the same thing. But in the case of proportionality, it seems we also have a larger set of criteria to be applied. Proportionality in a strict sense, taken as a balancing between the means employed and the ends pursued, can be found, for example, in Abdulaziz versus United Kingdom. In this case, the UK government had not provided a reasonable and objective justification for denying some women residing in the UK permission to be joined by their husbands, all non-nationals. So the means employed were not proportionate to the end that the UK government was trying to achieve. Balancing. In the public common law, this is another example that comes from public common law. In Pulfield versus Minister of Agriculture, another English case, the minister did not appoint a committee to investigate complaints made by members of the Milk Marketing Board about the scheme established for fixing the price of milk. The House of Lords decided that the minister's reasons were irrelevant and seemed to frustrate the purposes of the legislation and leave the appellant's claims dissatisfied. So here we find a judgment of an incorrect balancing applied by the minister, and the judicial review is aimed at correcting this unbalance that was created. Balancing is extensively at work also in tort law, where the main issue is that of finding an acceptable point of compromise between freedom of pursuing one's activities and security from risks for third parties. And often the appeal to the reasonable person that I introduced to you earlier in the common law can be interpreted as a balancing between these different values. There is a large domain of opinions by the courts concerning this kind of judgment. It is judgment in which, on the one hand, there are rights of freedom of pursuing one's activities on the side of the parties. On the other side, however, there is security for parties that can be eventually harmed by the activity that is pursued by the first party. So a sort of balance has to be drawn, and this balance is never once for all. This is another very important and peculiar point concerned with balancing. Balancing is always contextual. It has to do with the peculiar circumstances of a case. And it also has to do to all the relevant facts of that case. This is to say that even if the issue at stake is the same in a case a few months to come or a few years to come, if the circumstances are different, if the relevant facts are different, there is no hindrance that the court is going to give a different judgment from the one that was given in the first case. A further use of reasonableness, and something in which we run into also in the morning, is social acceptability. This comes from common law, but can be recognized also in constitutional adjudication in civil law. And this is the example that I was giving in the morning in the Lochner, the famous Lochner case in the American jurisprudence. The Supreme Court invalidated a New York state statute which prohibited bakery employees to work more than 10 hours per day. In that case, the dissenting opinion, I am repeating this for those who were not in the morning with us, the dissenting opinion by a famous American justice, that is judge of the Supreme Court, Justice Holmes, he said a reasonable person, if confronted with the facts of the case, would probably oppose the opinion of the majority. The majority was invalidating the statute, and the statute was simply as what we would call as a social measure, something that was protecting the work of bakers from being exploited by their employers, and he was saying it is quite likely that in the United States of the beginning of the 20th century, this was a 1905 case, at least a majority of them, or a large part of the population, would approve measures taken for protecting workers, because these measures by now have been accepted by the conscience of the population. They are socially acceptable, so they are reasonable. That's the meaning that is used. So, after all these uses, the question that comes to our mind is any red thread that unites these cases, that some minimal common denominator, as I said before. We've been confronting logical coherence, consistency, and equality of treatment that seem to have in common a demand of logical order of a legal system, and among its basic values, lest it collapses in arbitrary application of the law. So this set of meanings seems to have this direction, let's say. Then we confront fitness, means, ends, and efficiency, criteria of interpretation that betray the teleological tension of reasonableness. It entails the realization of a balance and realizing a certain end, given the means available in an optimal way. So this is something that goes in another direction. It's something of a teleological direction. The first seems to be connected with the order of a system and of its values. Then we have the proportionality balancing set of criteria. And this is what, in my view, is mostly characteristic of reasonableness in contemporary liberal society. It is what entails a plurality of values that in conflicting situations have often to be pondered against each other to reach compromises of common benefit. This is what is most relevant if we take a look at Rawls' public reason. All Rawls' construction of public reason is based on the problem of pluralism of values and conflictuality. Conflictuality is what raises the problem of how we solve these conflicts of values. And balancing is the way out of the legal system. Of course, Rawls' political construction is the general framework in which, however, the role of the Supreme Court in one of the passages of political liberalism is very important. Finally, the last dimension last meaning we've been confronting is social acceptability, that shows the social and cultural dimension of reasonableness. The problem here is that a decision should not be imposed against the dominant values of a society. And here is where I believe we can bring to a point of compromise those two views that I was referring to when I quoted Ferrara and Michelman in the morning. That is the philosophical approach and the originalist approach to interpretation. The philosophical approach, that is imposing from the outside, from the abstract, a set of values, even a principle of justice that doesn't connect, that is not doesn't cross the sensibilities of the citizens of a society, cannot be accepted. And this is something that Rawls was perfectly aware of when he decided to join the theoretical construction behind the veil of ignorance with the intuitions, the discourse of reflexive equilibrium and the necessity of finding a point of union.
Can you show the previous one? Just 1 second, the names that you gave to the other criteria, the first two, just, sorry?
This one.
Coherence and
Yes.
fitness, okay?
Okay. So now we come, after these few hints, to pose again the problem of the normative thrust of reasonableness. Is there anything such as this thing? Can we reach a normative thrust of reasonableness? In the philosophical camp this time, because we've been moving in the legal camp mainly so far. A philosopher by the name of Alan Gilbert, notes that etymologically the words rational and reasonable are near synonyms. Each derives from the Latin word ratio, ratio we would say, meaning reason, and the two derivatives of ratio, that are rationalis and rationabilis, differ only in that the latter's meaning is more explicitly dispositional. In the latter, that is in rationabilis, the meaning is more explicitly dispositional. So, Gilbert accounts for rationality as adopting the most efficient means to achieving one's ends, whatever they may be. So it's sort of instrumental conception of rationality. While a reasonable person takes due account of the interests of others, respecting their rights and maintaining an equitable consideration between oneself and others. So there is some moral flavor in the idea of the reasonable person, in the idea of what is reasonable all over Rawls' conception. And now, in fact, we come to John Rawls, who said, "What rational agents lack is the particular form of moral sensibility that underlies the desire to engage in fair cooperation as such. By contrast, reasonable persons, we say, are not moved by the general good as such, but desire for its own sake a social work in which they, as free and equal, can cooperate with others on terms all can accept." So this is the contrast, the rational and the reasonable. That is, several places of political liberalism raised by Rawls. But this is the real contrast. It's the contrast that I try to draw using von Wright's hints. Von Wright contrasts rationality, taken as formal correctness of reasoning, efficiency of means to an end, confirmation and testing of beliefs, in a way goal-oriented judgments, and you see how this understanding of rationality is larger than the one by Rawls. He contrasts this rationality with reasonableness, that it conceives as concerned with the right way of living, with what is thought good or bad for man, value-oriented judgments. So, at least one thing seems clear to me here is that the idea of reasonableness that von Wright is proposing is more ethically oriented than in the case of Rawls. Rawls' idea is basically morally oriented. This is ethically oriented. Of course, I'm distinguishing here with using a distinction that is quite well used in the literature between ethics as being concerned with, say, the good life of people, the right way of living of individuals, while morality is concerned with the way we should behave towards others. Now, someone who builds on von Wright's distinction is a famous legal theorist, German legal theorist, Robert Alexi, who proposes an exclusive and inclusive interpretation of reasonableness. In the exclusive interpretation, reasonableness does not cover logical correctness, efficiency, and empirical truth, or reliability, because these remain within the domain of rationality. So this is a concern of rationality. While reasonableness is concerned mostly with the right and or the good, so is taken up from von Wright quite evidently. In the inclusive interpretation, reasonableness covers also these meanings. Within ethical reasonableness, in a broad sense, and so we include the political sense of reasonableness, we find something described by Alexis, three criteria. One, correct interpretation of the interests of others. Two, egalitarian treatment of the interests of all. Three, critical discussion of different interests, convictions, and traditions, including one's own. So here I believe that the criteria that Alexi introduces are not incompatible with what Rawls was proposing. It seems that basically there is the point is that of giving a fair treatment to the interest of all those whose interests are included in a certain case. And another point is the point of the critical discussion, because one important point in Rawls' discourse is that of giving to each person at least the possibility of expressing his or her own opinion, and the possibility of having voice to express her preferences, her values, and introduce them in the common discussion. From the point of view of substantive normative equality of treatment and proportionality balance normative criteria, equality of treatment and proportionality balancing express what is most relevant to reasonableness in accordance with Alexis' criteria, and as we shall see, with the same structure of reasonableness. The idea of the structure that is just in a few steps coming out. Can you see? Okay, good. So I can have a better look at what is.
So you write in German normally,
yes. Yes. So even that I write in German, I can show you the last steps. And when interests or values conflict, a judicial or else decision is reasonably justified if all interests or values are correctly interpreted, but especially if each is discussed critically on a standpoint of impartiality that does not favor any of them. Proportionality balancing is aimed at giving a reasonable assessment of the interest at stake in each concrete situation. So one basic point, if nothing else is clear, at least one basic point must be clear. That is that when we talk about a reasonable judgment, if it is reasonable, it has to entail a correct interpretation and justification of the interests or values at stake and the possibility of discussing them critically on a standpoint of impartiality. So, not neutrality that we've been discussing in the morning, but the point is impartiality. Von Wright ranges more widely than this. His reference to what is good or bad for man covers all that is ethically relevant in an Aristotelian sense, while Alexis' criteria neglect what is reasonable for the agent from his or her point of view. Now, I'm introducing this distinction just because Alexis says explicitly that he's taking his point from Von Wright. He is inspired by Von Wright criterion, but then he misses track of what was the real content of Von Wright understanding of reasonableness. Now, some few and final hints on the structure of reasonableness. There are three structural facets of reasonableness, but this doesn't necessarily exhaust the issue. The first, of course, is balancing. The second is the question of facts. The third is the opposition universal particulars. And here I have to introduce another character in our story, that is the Scottish legal theorist Neil McCormick, who gives a suggestion that Alexis himself endorses, or at least seems to endorse. McCormick says, reasons do not have weights as material objects do. We might agree with the latter in using, latter is Alexis, in using a scale with vague stages such as light, moderate, and serious. Now, the quotation makes sense because Alexis is the one that is trying to structure reasonableness. And he wants to give a structure that is quite formalized. He uses, and this is familiar for all of you that have given, I hope, a look at one of the papers that I sent. He wants to give a formal structure of the procedure of balancing. And he wants to use a scale with vague stages such as light, moderate, and serious. And he tries to apply this criteria of judgment in a few cases, especially in this case that I've been referring about, that is the case decided by the German, and I'm almost finished, by the German Federal Constitutional Court regarding the duty of tobacco producers to adopt measures to protect the health of smokers. On the grounds of a serious danger of smoking as causing mortal disease, the Federal Constitutional Court assesses empirical evidence from medical research and, after balancing with the tobacco producers' freedom, may conclude in favor of a strong measure to protect smokers' health. Now, I am referring the narrative of the case, but of course he wants to apply this formal structure that you find in the paper to a case of this sort. The second point, the question of facts, is an aspect of reasonableness that seems to escape almost entirely that large part of constitutional doctrine, especially in civil law, that discusses the normative criteria of reasonableness. But the question of facts, as I have been mentioning just a few minutes ago, is very important with regards to this particular criterion, to reasonableness, because what is reasonable in a certain case cannot be as such in another case that is still treating with the same problem, but in a different context with different particulars, with different facts. And often facts are the particulars of the case, most of the times. There is a coincidence. In another case, and in another English case, Lord Denning, Qualcast, while questions of law concern the courts and their decisions have obligatory force on later ones or higher courts on lower ones, this is not so in the case of questions of facts. These are decided by a jury which is not bound by circumstances of a decision of a previous case, because matters for evidence may change according to time and evolution in a certain practice or profession. So this is what is the problem of facts. that they are extremely changing. Following Aristotle, the variability of human things is something that cannot easily be categorized in general or even universal categories. And the judgment of facts entails, as another British author who deals with the problem of reasonableness, in particular the reasonable person, he observes passing the buck, he uses this nice expression, from law to facts, moving to extra-legal standards of justification which leave the judge free to set different legal standards on the same issue in future cases. Passing the buck to facts does not entail only extra-legal standards, but also a careful attention to the particulars of the case, without forgetting the universalistic aspects of legal rules. So here we have a clear explanation of why the facts are important. And we have also a clue about this kind of judgment as being a way through in the law of something that comes from outside the law, say ethical, moral values. Going quickly towards the end, given the complexity of the notion of reasonableness that derives from its multiple dimensions, there are areas of reasonableness, such as subjective reasonableness, that we left out of the picture, but this I already said. And now I come to the questions. I've been asked 4 questions. These are my questions. First, given the large variety of uses of reasonableness in civil law and common law, does it still make sense to consider it a unique notion? 2. Given the variability of human situations that can concern reasonableness, is Alexis' formal structure acceptable? 3. Alexis concludes by saying that law allows a better mastering of reasonable balancing. Is this granted by the examples we know of? 4. What kind of common thread, if any, can we trace in the variety of judicial uses we have examined? Of course, I've given already my clues, but they can be discussed and criticized and actually come out with something different. I've finished. Thank you.